The grand hallways of Somerton High School gleamed with trophies and banners from years of tradition and excellence. But behind the shine, a darkness lingered. A darkness that had wrapped its cold, unforgiving grip around Rachel Dawson. Once a spirited young girl with a bright smile, she now moved through her days as a shadow of herself. To her father, John, this change was more than alarming. It was terrifying. John Dawson had always been a man of action, a father who could fix anything. Yet, day by day, he watched his daughter slip further away, her silence heavier than words. She had become distant, secretive, and withdrawn. But it wasn't until the day he found her crying in the school bathroom that he realized just how deep the problem went. It wasn't just typical teenage angst. Something far more sinister was lurking behind the walls of Somerton High. And when Rachel finally opened up, it wasn't just her that needed saving. Her revelation set off a chain of events that would unravel secrets far darker than anyone could have anticipated. "Rachel?" John's voice echoed softly in the Dawson home, carrying a weight of concern. It was unusually quiet when he got home early from work that day. As he settled into his favorite armchair, papers in hand, the sound of the front door creaked open. Rachel stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked like a shell of the daughter he once knew. "Rachel, honey, what's going on?" His voice was calm, but inside his nerves were frayed. He knew something had been wrong for weeks. "Nothing, Dad," she replied, her voice a hollow whisper. John frowned. It was the same line she'd been giving him over and over. But this time her words felt more forced, as if she was barely holding something back. "Are you sure?" he pressed gently, stepping closer. But Rachel didn't answer. She turned and hurried up the stairs, closing her bedroom door behind her. John stood in silence, listening to the faint sound of her sobbing on the other side. His heart sank. In the kitchen, John's wife, Marie, wiped her hands on a dish towel and looked over at him, the worry clear in her eyes. "Did she say anything?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "No," John sighed, rubbing his temples in frustration. "She won't talk to me. It's like she's shut us out completely." Marie leaned against the counter, her face tightening with concern. "Maybe it's just school stress. She's been pushing herself hard lately." John shook his head. "No, it's not that. Something's wrong, Marie. Something bad." As the night wore on, the Dawson home was shrouded in an eerie quiet. The usual warmth and chatter were replaced with a thick tension that none of them could shake. John kept glancing up the stairs, wondering what his daughter was hiding. He could feel it in his gut. This wasn't normal teenage behavior. Something deeper was at play.
The following day, John left work early again. He couldn't focus, his mind constantly returning to Rachel's distant, troubled expression. It was nearing 4 p.m., and Rachel should have been home by now, yet the house was silent. Just as he was about to call her, the door swung open. Rachel stumbled in, looking even worse than the day before. Her hair was disheveled, her face drawn and pale, but what truly alarmed John was that she didn't have her school bag with her. Rachel never forgot her schoolwork. Never. "Rachel, where's your backpack? What's going on?" he asked, the urgency rising in his voice. For a split second, he saw fear flicker across her face before she quickly looked away. I must have left it at school," she stammered. "Rachel," he pressed, stepping toward her. "Tell me the truth. Are you being bullied? Is someone hurting you?" Her lip quivered, and for a moment, John thought she was finally going to break. But then she turned away. "Dad, please, just drop it. I can't talk about it right now." John felt helpless as she disappeared upstairs once more, leaving him with more questions than answers. That night, after hours of anxious pacing and fruitless discussions with Marie, John made a decision. He grabbed his phone and dialed the number of Rachel's teacher, Mr. Fletcher, the one teacher who had always seemed cold and distant toward his daughter. His gut told him that Fletcher knew something, and John wasn't going to rest until he found out what it was. "Hello, Mr. Fletcher," John said when the line clicked. There was a long pause before Fletcher's voice came through, flat and almost annoyed. "Yes, this is Fletcher. It's John Dawson, Rachel's father. I'm calling because I'm worried about my daughter. She's been acting differently, and I was wondering if something happened at school." Another pause. Then Fletcher's voice, colder now. "Nothing's happened. Everything's fine." "Are you sure?" John pressed. She's been upset, and I know she's had trouble with some students. Fletcher cut him off, his voice sharp. Mr. Dorson, it's late. I don't think it's appropriate to call me about something like this at this hour. I'm a teacher, not a therapist. John's stomach tightened. The dismissive tone, the sudden defensiveness, something wasn't right. Before he could respond, Fletcher ended the call. John stared at the phone in disbelief. What was he hiding? The next morning, Rachel was gone before John could talk to her. But as he sat in his office, his mind kept returning to that strange call with Mr. Fletcher. He knew something was wrong, and he wasn't going to sit by and let his daughter suffer in silence. By noon, he had made up his mind. He left work, drove straight to Somerton High, and went directly to the principal's office. John burst into the principal's office without knocking, his face set in grim determination. Principal Harris, a woman in her mid-50s with a no-nonsense demeanor, looked up from her desk, surprised by the sudden intrusion. "Mr. Dorson," she began, standing up. "Is there something I can help you with?" John didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "Something's happening to my daughter at this school, and I think Mr. Fletcher has something to do with it. She's been coming home upset, and she's not telling us what's going on. I need answers." Principal Harris's face tightened slightly. "I assure you, Mr. Dorson, if there's a problem, we'll address it. But making accusations against a teacher without proof—" "This isn't just about proof," John interrupted, his voice hardening. "It's about my daughter's well-being. She's been crying, avoiding her schoolwork, and now she's terrified to talk to me. I called Mr. Fletcher last night, and the way he reacted, something is going on. I want to know what it is." Principal Harris studied John for a moment before she sat back down. "Rachel is an excellent student, Mr. Dorson. I haven't received any reports of issues in her classes, but I will personally speak with Mr. Fletcher and see if there's anything we need to be concerned about." John clenched his jaw, frustrated by the bureaucratic response, but he knew pushing further wouldn't get him anywhere. "I'll expect a follow-up," he said, his voice cold as he turned and left the office. But as he walked back to his car, a sinking feeling settled in his chest. He knew deep down that a conversation with Mr. Fletcher wasn't going to solve this problem. Whatever was happening to Rachel, it was bigger than one teacher's word against another. Later that day, John waited outside the house, pacing the driveway. He had planned to talk to Rachel the moment she got home, but time stretched out, and Rachel was late, again. When she finally arrived, her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she fumbled with her keys. John could see the strain in her eyes, the exhaustion that went beyond schoolwork. He gently took her by the shoulders as soon as she stepped inside. "Rachel, please," he said softly. "I know something's wrong. You don't have to face this alone." Rachel stood frozen for a moment, her eyes darting between her father and the floor. Then, without warning, her resolve seemed to shatter. Tears welled up in her eyes and her knees buckled slightly as she collapsed into his arms. "Dad," she sobbed, "I can't go back to school. I can't face him again." John's heart pounded. "Face who, Rachel? What's happening?"
She hesitated, but then the words came tumbling out, the weight of them almost too much to bear. "Mr. Fletcher. He's been saying things to me. About my skin, about how I don't belong in his class. He makes comments in front of the other students and they all laugh. He calls me out in front of everyone, makes me stay after class for no reason, and... Dad, it's getting worse. Today he made a joke about me using white chalk and how it might be useful for someone like me." John's breath caught in his throat. His hands clenched into fists as he tried to process what his daughter was telling him. "Rachel, why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice trembling with both anger and guilt. "I thought I could handle it," she whispered, her voice barely audible through her sobs. "I didn't want to make it a bigger deal, and I thought maybe I was overreacting. But today, I couldn't take it anymore." John held his daughter tightly, his chest aching with the sheer rage building inside him. How could this have been happening to her right under his nose? How had no one at the school done anything to stop it? "You did the right thing by telling me," he said, his voice filled with a quiet fury. "We're going to fix this. I promise you, Rachel, no one is going to hurt you like this ever again." The next morning, John stormed into Somerton High with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't going to wait for the school's bureaucratic process to unfold. He was going to make sure that everyone, from the principal to the school board, knew exactly what kind of man Mr. Fletcher really was. He demanded a meeting with Principal Harris and arrived with Rachel by his side, determined to let her voice be heard. When they were seated in the office, John wasted no time. "Rachel has something to tell you," he said, his voice steady but hard. Rachel hesitated for a moment, but then, with a deep breath, she began to speak. She recounted every humiliating comment, every incident where Mr. Fletcher had targeted her because of her race. Her voice shook, but her resolve was clear. She was tired of hiding the truth, and she wasn't going to let fear silence her any longer. Principal Harris listened in silence, her face growing more grim with every word. "Rachel," the principal said when she finally spoke, "I am so sorry that this has happened to you. This is absolutely unacceptable, and I promise you, we will investigate this immediately. Mr. Fletcher will be placed on leave while we look into these allegations." John nodded, his jaw still tight with anger. "I expect more than an investigation, Principal Harris. I want accountability. My daughter deserves justice." Principal Harris met his gaze evenly. "Mr. Dorson, I assure you, we take this very seriously. We will not tolerate any form of discrimination in our school."
But as they left the office, John couldn't help but wonder if those words would truly be enough. Would the school actually follow through, or would they try to sweep it under the rug like so many institutions before them? The next week was a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and legal consultations. John wasn't going to let this die quietly. He connected with lawyers, civil rights advocates, and the local media, determined to shine a light on the dark undercurrent of racism that had seeped into his daughter's school life. But as the pressure mounted, so did the backlash. Whispers started to circulate in the hallways of Somerton High. Some of Rachel's classmates began to avoid her, while others made cruel remarks under their breath. John knew that exposing the truth would come at a cost, but he hadn't anticipated just how isolating it would feel for Rachel. "Dad, maybe we should just drop it," Rachel said one evening, her voice weary from the emotional toll. "Everyone at school looks at me differently now. Maybe I should just transfer and forget this ever happened." John shook his head firmly. "No, Rachel. We can't let them win. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about every student who's ever been treated unfairly because of who they are. We have to stand up to this." Rachel nodded, though tears brimmed in her eyes. She was brave, but she was also just a teenager, carrying a weight that would break most adults. John wished he could protect her from all of it, but he knew the only way forward was to keep fighting. As the school board's investigation dragged on, new stories began to surface. Other students of color, came forward with their own accounts of Mr. Fletcher's inappropriate comments and racially charged remarks. It became clear that this was no isolated incident. This was a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. The day finally came when the school board called a public meeting to address the growing scandal. The room was packed with parents, teachers, and students, all eager to see what would come of the allegations. John sat in the front row, his hands clenched into fists as he listened to the school board's representatives speak in vague terms about reviewing policies and making improvements. It wasn't enough. It was nowhere near enough. Finally, John couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, his voice ringing out above the hum of the crowd. "You're talking about policies and procedures like this is some minor issue, but this is my daughter's life you're discussing. Mr. Fletcher has been systematically bullying and discriminating against students of color, and you're treating it like a PR problem." The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at him. John's face was flushed with anger, but his voice was steady. "This isn't just about Rachel," he continued. "It's about every student who's been made to feel less than, who's been silenced because they didn't think anyone would believe them. Well, we believe them, and we're not going to stop until real changes are made." The pressure worked. The media caught wind of the scandal, and soon, headlines across the state were covering the story of Somerton High's racism problem. Under the mounting scrutiny, the school board finally took action. Mr. Fletcher was fired, his teaching licenses revoked, and new diversity training programs were implemented across the district. But even as justice was served, John knew that the battle wasn't over. Rachel had been scarred by the experience, and it would take time for her to heal. Yet, as he looked at his daughter, he saw a strength in her that filled him with pride. They had faced this darkness together, and they had come out the other side stronger. Rachel's voice had been heard, and it had changed everything. In the weeks that followed, Somerton High School was transformed. It wasn't just the school's administration that was shaken to its core. Students, teachers, and even the community beyond the campus began to confront the ugly reality of what had been happening right under their noses. Rachel returned to school, her head held high, but things were different now. She had become somewhat of a reluctant symbol, her name mentioned in hallways, her face recognized even by students she had never spoken to. Some looked at her with admiration, while others, those who didn't understand the gravity of what had happened, looked at her with resentment. But she never let it stop her. John, too, felt the weight of the aftermath. He had expected justice to bring relief, but it also brought attention, more than he had anticipated. Reporters reached out, community leaders praised his family's courage, and other parents quietly confided that their children had experienced similar situations but had been too scared to speak up. Yet through it all, John remained focused on one thing: his daughter. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, the weight of everything finally seemed to lift, if only for a moment. Marie had prepared Rachel's favorite meal, spaghetti and meatballs, and there was a calmness in the air that felt almost foreign after weeks of tension. Rachel twirled her fork in her spaghetti, her expression thoughtful. "You know, Dad," she said after a long silence, "I've been thinking, maybe all of this happened for a reason." John looked up from his plate, surprised by the maturity in her words. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Rachel hesitated, searching for the right way to explain what she was feeling. "I mean, if Mr. Fletcher hadn't said those things, if I hadn't gone through all that, maybe no one would have stood up to him. Maybe he would have kept doing it, and other kids would have kept getting hurt." John's chest tightened with emotion as he listened to his daughter. He had been so focused on the injustice of it all, on the fight for accountability, that he hadn't fully realized just how much Rachel had grown through the experience. "You're right," he said softly. "It shouldn't have happened in the first place, but you made sure it ended. You made a difference." Rachel smiled faintly, but John could see the exhaustion behind her eyes. She was still processing everything, still healing. He knew it would take time, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of hope. His daughter wasn't just surviving this ordeal. She was rising above it. As the story continued to unfold in the media, the Dorson family was approached by civil rights organizations, advocacy groups, and even legal experts who wanted to use their case as a launching point for broader reforms in the education system. There were discussions about town hall meetings, policy changes, and potential lawsuits aimed at holding the school district accountable for allowing a teacher like Mr. Fletcher to operate unchecked for so long. But amidst all the noise, John remained focused on what mattered most: Rachel's well-being. "Dad," Rachel said one evening, catching him off guard as they sat in the living room. "I've been thinking about what you said, about standing up for others. I think I want to do something with this. I want to help other kids who are going through the same thing." John stared at her for a moment, his heart swelling with pride. He had always known his daughter was strong, but this was something else entirely. She wasn't just healing, she was turning her pain into purpose. "That's incredible, Rachel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll support you in whatever you decide to do." As the months passed, Rachel became increasingly involved in local advocacy work. She joined a student-led organization that focused on promoting diversity and inclusion in schools across the district. She spoke at community meetings, sharing her story and encouraging other students to speak up about their experiences. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the weight of it all felt overwhelming. But Rachel was determined. John watched with awe as his daughter blossomed into a young leader. She had faced unimaginable adversity, But instead of letting it break her, she had used it to fuel her desire for change. One evening, Rachel came home from a meeting with her advocacy group, her face flushed with excitement. "Dad, guess what?" she said, her voice bubbling with energy. "We're organizing a district-wide event next month to talk about racial discrimination in schools. We're going to invite students, teachers, parents, everyone, and they asked me to be one of the speakers." John's eyes widened in surprise, a smile spreading across his face. "That's amazing, Rachel. You're going to do great." She grinned, though there was a nervous edge to her excitement. "I'm a little scared," she admitted, biting her lip. "What if I mess up?" John shook his head, leaning forward and taking her hand. "Rachel, you've already done the hardest thing. You spoke up when it mattered most. This is just another chance to make a difference, and I know you'll be incredible." The day of the district-wide event arrived, and the auditorium was packed. Students, teachers, parents, and community members filled the seats, all eager to hear the stories of those who had experienced racial discrimination firsthand. John and Marie sat in the front row, their hearts swelling with pride as they watched Rachel take the stage. She looked nervous at first, but as she began to speak, her voice grew stronger, more confident. "When I first decided to speak out about what happened to me, I was scared," Rachel began, her eyes scanning the crowd. "I was scared of what people would think, of how it would affect my life. But then I realized something. Staying silent wasn't going to protect me. It wasn't going to protect anyone else. The only way to make change is to speak up, even when it's hard." The room was silent as Rachel shared her story, her words carrying the weight of her experience. She talked about the pain of being singled out, the fear of facing discrimination, and the strength it took to come forward. But she also talked about the support she had found, her family, her community, and the other students who had stood by her. "We can't let fear stop us," Rachel said, her voice ringing out with conviction. "We have to be brave enough to stand up for what's right, even when it feels like the whole world is against us." When she finished, the room erupted in applause. John wiped a tear from his eye as he watched his daughter stand tall, her face glowing with pride. She had come so far, and in that moment, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, Rachel would face them with the same courage and determination that had carried her through this ordeal. In the aftermath of the event, the momentum for change continued to grow. Rachel's speech had inspired students across the district to come forward with their own stories, and the school board was forced to take even more concrete steps to address the systemic issues that had allowed discrimination to fester in the first place. New policies were put in place, aimed at protecting students from harassment and ensuring that all schools in the district were places of inclusion and respect. Diversity training for teachers became mandatory, and a hotline was established for students to report incidents of discrimination anonymously. But beyond the policy changes, something deeper had shifted. The culture at Somerton High and in schools across the district began to change. Students were more aware of the impact their words and actions could have. Teachers were more vigilant, more willing to listen to their students, and parents, like John, became more involved, ensuring that their children's voices were heard. For Rachel, the experience had transformed her life in ways she never could have imagined. She had gone from a quiet student afraid to speak up to a passionate advocate for justice, determined to make sure that no one else would have to go through what she had endured. As the year drew to a close, Rachel was awarded a special recognition from the school board for her courage and leadership. Standing on stage with her family by her side, she accepted the award with grace and humility, knowing that the fight for justice was far from over. "This isn't the end," Rachel said in her acceptance speech, her eyes shining with determination. "This is just the beginning. We have to keep pushing for change, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us. We have to make sure that our schools are places where everyone feels safe, where everyone is treated with respect, and we can't stop until that happens." As she stepped down from the stage, John couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of pride. His daughter had faced adversity head-on, and she had emerged stronger, braver, and more determined than ever. Rachel had found her voice. And in doing so, she had changed the world around her. As the months passed, Rachel's involvement in advocacy work only deepened. Her story had sparked something bigger than any of them had anticipated, and now she found herself at the center of a movement. The small student-led group she had joined grew rapidly, attracting attention from schools across the region. They named the organization Voices Unheard, with a mission to empower students to speak out against discrimination and inequality in schools. Rachel had become a natural leader within the group, helping to organize workshops, speaking events, and outreach programs. She was invited to conferences to share her story and collaborate with other young activists who were fighting similar battles. The once quiet, reserved girl who had hesitated to speak up was now an advocate for students who had been silenced for far too long. But with the newfound attention came challenges Rachel hadn't anticipated. She was constantly in the spotlight, and there were moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable. She missed the simplicity of her old life, where she could blend in and focus on her schoolwork without the pressure of being a public figure. One evening, as the stress of balancing school, activism, and her personal life became overwhelming, Rachel found herself sitting on the back porch, staring out at the stars. She had been doing well in school, but the emotional toll of the last few months was catching up with her. John joined her quietly, taking a seat beside her and handing her a cup of tea. For a while, they sat in silence, the cool night air a welcome respite from the intensity of their lives. "It's a lot, isn't it?" John finally said, his voice soft. Rachel nodded, her eyes fixed on the sky. "I didn't expect it to be this hard, Dad. I thought once we got justice, things would be better. But now, it just feels like there's always more to do. More people who need help, more stories that need to be told, and I don't know if I can handle it all." John placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You've been carrying a lot, Rachel. More than most people your age should ever have to. But remember, you're not in this alone. You've got your family, your friends, and your whole community behind you. You don't have to fix everything by yourself." Rachel sighed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I just don't want to let anyone down. So many people are counting on me now." "And you won't let them down," John reassured her. "But you also need to take care of yourself. It's okay to step back when you need to. It doesn't make you any less strong." Rachel nodded, grateful for her father's words. She had been so focused on fighting for others that she had forgotten to take care of herself. It was a lesson she was still learning, how to balance her passion for activism with the need for self-care. Over time, Rachel learned how to manage the demands of her new role while also carving out space for herself. She started seeing a therapist, something John and Marie had gently encouraged her to do. The therapy sessions became a safe place for her to process the trauma of what she had been through and the pressure of being in the public eye. It wasn't easy, but slowly, Rachel began to find a balance. Her relationship with her parents also deepened through the process. John and Marie had always been close to Rachel, but after everything they had been through together, their bond was stronger than ever. They were there for her through every victory and setback, always ready with words of encouragement or a shoulder to cry on. John, in particular, felt a renewed sense of purpose. Watching his daughter grow into such a powerful voice for change made him reflect on his own life, his own role as a father and a member of the community. He had always prided himself on being a problem solver, someone who could fix things when they went wrong. But through this experience, he had learned that sometimes the best way to help was simply to listen and be present. 1 year after the initial confrontation with Mr. Fletcher, Somerton High School held its annual spring assembly. This time, it was different. The school had undergone a transformation, not just in policies, but in its culture. Diversity and inclusion were no longer just buzzwords. They had become a central part of the school's identity. As part of the assembly, the school invited Rachel to give a keynote speech. Standing in front of her peers, teachers, and community members, Rachel felt a rush of nerves, but also a deep sense of pride. She had come so far since that day in the bathroom, when she had felt so small and powerless. Now she was standing tall, ready to speak her truth. "When I first spoke out about what was happening to me," Rachel began, her voice strong and clear. I was terrified. I didn't know if anyone would listen or if they would believe me. But I learned something important through this process. Our voices matter. Each of us has the power to stand up for what's right, even when it feels like the world is against us. The auditorium was silent as Rachel continued, her words resonating deeply with those in the audience. What happened to me wasn't just about one teacher. It was about a system that allowed discrimination to go unchecked. But because we spoke up, because we refused to stay silent, things are changing. And that change doesn't stop here. It's something we have to keep fighting for every day, in our schools, in our communities, and in our lives. When Rachel finished her speech, the room erupted in applause. John and Marie, sitting in the front row, stood up, clapping harder than anyone else. Tears filled John's eyes as he watched his daughter standing on that stage, knowing how much courage it had taken for her to get there. After the assembly, students and teachers alike came up to Rachel to thank her, to tell her how much her story had inspired them. Some of them shared their own experiences, while others simply expressed admiration for her bravery. One student, a freshman named Amira, approached Rachel shyly after the crowd had thinned out. She was small, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and wide, nervous eyes. "Hi," Amira said, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to say thank you for everything you've done. I'm a Muslim, and sometimes people make me feel like I don't belong. But after hearing your story, I feel like I can stand up for myself too." Rachel smiled warmly, her heart swelling with emotion. "You do belong, Amira, and don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here for you, okay?" Amira's face lit up, and she nodded, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you. That means a lot." As Amira walked away, Rachel realized that helping others find their voice, was what mattered most. It wasn't about the headlines or the recognition. It was about making sure that no one else ever had to feel the way she had felt. As Rachel continued her advocacy work, she became a mentor to younger students, guiding them through their own struggles with discrimination and injustice. She started a peer support group at Somerton High, where students could come together to share their experiences and support one another. It was a space where no one had to feel alone, a space where their voices were not only heard, but celebrated. John and Marie continued to support Rachel every step of the way. They attended her events, helped organize her advocacy projects, and made sure she always had a strong foundation to fall back on at home. For John, watching his daughter grow into a leader had been one of the most profound experiences of his life. He had always believed in her, but seeing her use her voice to inspire change filled him with a sense of pride he could barely put into words. As the years passed, Rachel's impact only grew. She went on to study social justice and education reform in college, determined to continue her fight for equality. She interned with organizations that worked to dismantle systemic racism in schools, and by the time she graduated, she had already published several articles on the subject. Her advocacy work reached a national audience, and soon she was speaking at conferences across the country, sharing her story and the lessons she had learned along the way. But no matter how far she went, she never forgot where it all started, in the hallways of Somerton High, where one teacher's cruelty had sparked a movement. Years later, Rachel found herself back in her hometown, standing in front of a group of high school students at Somerton High. This time, she wasn't a student herself but a guest speaker, invited to talk about her journey and the changes that had come from her fight for justice. As she stood in front of the students, some of whom hadn't even been born when her story first made headlines, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. "The world isn't perfect," Rachel told them, "but it's up to us to make it better. We can't let fear or silence stop us. We have to keep speaking up, keep pushing for change, no matter how hard it gets, because every voice matters, and when we come together, there's nothing we can't change." The students watched her with wide eyes, hanging on her every word. And Rachel knew, as she looked out at them, that the fight wasn't over. But it had been worth it. For every person who had felt silenced, for every student who had been made to feel like they didn't belong, Rachel had helped pave the way for a brighter, more inclusive future. and that was a legacy she was proud to leave behind. Over the next few years, Rachel's influence continued to grow, but so did her responsibilities. After graduating college, she decided to take her advocacy work to a national level, working alongside some of the most respected voices in education reform and social justice. She began developing programs that addressed not only racial discrimination, but also economic inequality, gender disparities, and access to quality education for underserved communities. Rachel had learned, through her experiences, that discrimination wasn't always overt like it had been with Mr. Fletcher. Sometimes it was more subtle. A lack of resources, lower expectations for students of color, or policies that disproportionately affected marginalized groups. Her goal now was to tackle these systemic issues from within, using the power of education to bring about meaningful change. Her work took her all over the country. She traveled to rural schools where students struggled with outdated materials and crumbling buildings, to inner-city districts where students faced the dual challenges of poverty and prejudice, and even to affluent communities where discrimination often took the form of exclusion rather than outright hostility. Everywhere she went, Rachel listened to students and teachers alike, taking in their stories and using her platform to amplify their voices. She knew that real change would take time, but with every meeting, every conference, and every speech, she could see the impact she was having. "We have to keep pushing," she would say at the end of every talk. "The road ahead is long, but we've already taken the first step, and together we'll keep moving forward." By the time Rachel turned 30, her name had become synonymous with education reform. She was regularly invited to speak at national conferences, and her articles on equity in education were widely published in major newspapers and academic journals. But even with all the accolades and attention, Rachel remained grounded. She never forgot where she came from or why she had started this journey in the first place. Her parents, John and Marie, were her biggest supporters throughout it all. They attended her speaking engagements when they could, and John often joked that they were like her groupies, following her from event to event. But in truth, they were proud beyond words. Watching Rachel grow into such a powerful force for change had been one of the greatest joys of their lives. One evening, as Rachel prepared for yet another keynote address at a major conference, she sat in her hotel room, reflecting on how far she had come. She had faced obstacles, setbacks, and moments of doubt, but she had never given up. Her journey had taught her that change was never easy, but it was always worth fighting for. Just as she was about to go over her notes one last time, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Amira, the young student she had met years ago at Somerton High, who had looked up to Rachel as a mentor. "Rachel," the message read, "I just wanted to let you know that I've been accepted into law school. I'm going to focus on civil rights and education law, just like we talked about. Thank you for everything. You showed me that I can make a difference, too." Rachel's heart swelled with pride. Amira had stayed in touch over the years, updating Rachel on her progress through high school and college. Rachel had always known that Amira had the potential to do great things, and now, seeing her take this next step filled her with a sense of fulfillment. "I'm so proud of you, Amira," Rachel replied. "You're going to change the world. Keep pushing, and never let anyone tell you that you can't." As she put down her phone, Rachel smiled to herself. Moments like this, knowing that she had inspired even one person to believe in themselves and fight for what was right, made everything worth it. The following day, Rachel stood in front of a packed auditorium, ready to deliver her speech. The room was filled with educators, policymakers, and activists, all eager to hear what she had to say. As she stepped up to the podium, she took a deep breath, scanning the faces of the audience. "I'm often asked how I got started in this work," Rachel began, her voice steady and confident. "And my answer is always the same. It wasn't by choice. I didn't wake up one day and decide to be an activist. My path was shaped by the experiences I had, by the injustices I witnessed and endured. But what I've learned is that it's not about how you start, it's about what you do with the challenges you face." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. We all have a role to play in making the world a better, more just place. And it starts with listening, listening to the voices that have been silenced, the stories that have been overlooked. Because when we listen, we can begin to understand. And when we understand, we can start to create real change. The audience was silent, hanging on her every word. I'm here today because someone listened to me. Because my family, my community, and eventually the world believed in my voice. And that's why I'm asking all of you to do the same. Listen to the students in your schools, the people in your neighborhoods, the voices that have been ignored for too long. And then, act. Don't wait for someone else to make the first move. Be the change you wish to see. Rachel's speech ended with a standing ovation, but it wasn't the applause that mattered to her. What mattered was that the people in that room left with a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to listening and taking action. As Rachel left the conference later that evening, she found herself thinking about the future. She had accomplished so much already, but there was still so much left to do. The fight for equality in education, and in society as a whole, was far from over. But Rachel was ready for whatever came next. She knew there would be more challenges, more battles to fight, but she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had built a community of allies, of people who believed in the same vision she did. Together, they would keep pushing for change, one step at a time. And as long as there were students like Amira, ready to carry the torch forward, Rachel knew that the future was bright. A few years later, Rachel's work reached new heights when she was invited to testify before Congress on the state of education reform. It was a monumental moment in her career, a chance to influence national policy and ensure that her voice and the voices of the students she represented were heard by those in power. John and Marie watched the live broadcast from their living room, their hearts swelling with pride as their daughter sat before the congressional committee, her posture straight, her face calm but determined. "Miss Dorson," one of the senators said, "you've been a vocal advocate for education reform for years now. What do you believe is the most urgent issue facing our schools today?" Rachel didn't hesitate. "Equity," she said firmly. "The most urgent issue is ensuring that every student, no matter where they come from, what they look like, or what their economic background is, has the same opportunities to succeed. We need to address the systemic barriers that have kept marginalized students from reaching their full potential. That means reforming our funding systems, diversifying our teaching staff, and ensuring that schools are safe, inclusive environments for all students." The senators listened intently as Rachel laid out her case, her voice unwavering as she discussed the policies and changes that needed to be made. It was a pivotal moment, not just for Rachel, but for the movement she had dedicated her life to. After the testimony, Rachel walked out of the Capitol building, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and hope. The work wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they were making progress. Slowly but surely, the walls of inequality were beginning to crack. That night, she called John and Marie to tell them about the experience. As they spoke, John couldn't help but reflect on how far they had all come since that first day in the school bathroom, when Rachel had finally told him the truth about what she had been going through. "You've done so much, Rachel," John said, his voice filled with emotion. "I'm so proud of you. You're changing the world." Rachel smiled through the phone, her heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad. Without you and Mom supporting me through everything." They talked for a while longer, reminiscing about the past and dreaming about the future. As Rachel hung up the phone, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had fought hard for what she believed in, and she wasn't done yet. But for now, she was content to pause, if only for a moment, and appreciate how far they had all come. Rachel's journey was far from over, but one thing was clear: she had made her mark, and the world was a better place because of it. The final chapter. Years later, as Rachel looked back on everything she had accomplished, she found herself filled with a deep sense of gratitude. She had faced battles she never could have imagined, met both personal and systemic, but she had never backed down. She had grown into a woman who used her voice not just for herself, but for all those who couldn't. Her advocacy work had taken her to places she had only dreamed of: Congress, international conferences, and even the United Nations. She had become a recognized leader in the fight for educational equity and justice, influencing policies that would impact generations to come. But in the end, it wasn't the speeches, the awards, or the recognition that mattered most to Rachel. What mattered were the individual lives she had touched, the students who had found their voices because of her. They were her true legacy. One evening, many years after that pivotal time in her life, Rachel sat on the porch of her family home, watching the sunset over the trees. John and Marie were inside, preparing dinner, their laughter floating out through the open windows. The air was warm, and there was a stillness to the evening that made Rachel feel at peace. Beside her, a young woman sat quietly, her eyes reflecting the fading light. It was Amira, now a law graduate and an advocate in her own right. The two of them had stayed close over the years, and tonight they were celebrating a new chapter in Amira's life. "You know," Amira said softly, "none of this would have happened without you, Rachel. You changed everything for me." Rachel smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "No, Amira, you changed everything for yourself. All I did was help you see what was already there. You had the strength all along." Amira looked at Rachel, her eyes filled with admiration. "You showed me the way, and now it's my turn to do that for someone else." Rachel nodded, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment wash over her. She had come full circle. The girl who had once felt powerless had now become a mentor, a guide, and a force for change. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Rachel felt a calm settle over her. She had fought her battles, faced her demons, and helped pave the way for a new generation of leaders like Amira. And though the world still had a long way to go, she knew that the future was bright, because now there were countless voices raised in unity, fighting for a better, more just world. And Rachel's voice, her story, would echo in each of them. As the evening deepened, John and Marie called from the kitchen, urging them to come in for dinner. Rachel stood, taking one last look at the sky, feeling the cool breeze on her face. She was ready to close this chapter, knowing that her work, her legacy, and her purpose would live on in every person she had touched. With a final, peaceful smile, Rachel walked inside to join her family.